Split screen. The art of sharing a part of your screen so others could join in on the action. But what is the story of this almost ancient technique, and why are fewer games being released with it? Today I intend to find out. Before we discuss split screen, we have to discuss multiplayer. Multiplayer has always been a thing in video games, but because of hardware limitations, some games had to be creative, especially those that could move beyond the edge of the screen. Games such as the original Super Mario Bros. Had only 40 kilobytes to work with, so they made you switch after the individual playing died. Because if you had two players moving simultaneously, that would probably put your console to its limits. The main problem was that multiplayer was too advanced for some games, but this would be fixed later as consoles started to get more advanced. Another problem was what would happen if players moved to different directions, and some games just fixed this by forcing them to stick together. But then came the problem for 3D racing games. Since you had to keep up with the players so that you could be on the same screen, you had to force the players into place. But what is the point of a racing game if you are practically glued to the other player? And that's when someone had an incredible idea. They split the screen. Split screen wasn't an entirely new idea, it had been around for a while, but racing games were the first to popularize it. But split screen led to even more technical problems, even for some 16 and 64-bit consoles. This was because splitting the screen meant you had to have more than twice the power of one console. Even running a racing game on its own was hard, especially because of the other racers. So developers made other racers invisible when out of sight. This meant that the game could run smoother and better. But now there are two players and the racers are in sight more than before. Of course they could just make the screens show different things, but they still had the problem in the form of consoles requiring the power of two. This meant that they had to decrease graphics and frames per second in order to have multiplayer with this new split screen idea. Practically all of split screen's problems was fixed early on for both 2D and 3D games, if you can even call it that. Because a lot of the 3D games I am speaking of is probably not what you think of when I say 3D games. You probably think of something like this.
PlayStation.
The original PlayStation was a breakthrough in home console technology, being one of the first truly 3D consoles. But as far as split screen goes, there isn't too much new to say. It could play split screen without a problem by again decreasing graphics and frames per second. But the console that really changed split screen is the Nintendo 64. Two more controller slots meant that Nintendo was really pushing the console to its limits. And luckily for me, it didn't explode this time. While PlayStation did eventually get an adapter which made 4 players possible, because the console on its own only had 2 slots for controllers, there weren't released as many 4-player games, as the audience was too specific. But Nintendo had 4-player capabilities at the start, which meant that they had a lot of 4-player support. A game that became popular because of the support is GoldenEye 007. The game was a first-person shooter, a fairly new type of genre. But most likely the genre that people associate with split screen, and that's because these games are required to use it if they want multiplayer on one console. Even though the maps were taken from the single player, the variety of set maps, game modes and weapons made it a huge hit and a lot of fun if you had a few friends. It even ended up getting Game of the Year. But the next year, a game from a different place would get that title. Half-Life was a game that turned into many multiplayer games such as Counter-Strike and Team Fortress Classic. But the unique thing was those games didn't need split screen. because they were online. The ability to play with people without split screen allowed bigger games and more advanced games such as the mentioned Counter-Strike and Team Fortress Classic, but also the Quake franchise, Medal of Honor, the list goes on. For now, online multiplayer would be an exclusive to PC, as it was the only place where you could be connected to the internet. So consoles stuck with split screen as it was the only way to have multiplayer. And that was very important because the intended audience was families. And being able to play more than just one appealed to said audience. It's now the early 2000s and Microsoft is entering the console market with their new Xbox. And the next step for split screen. Halo Combat evolved. The original Halo game did really evolve the combat. It had vehicles, an arsenal of unique weapons, tons of open and large maps, and a large variety of game modes and types. But the problem was just in the amount of players. Considering we only have 4 players, that meant that the biggest map feel a bit empty. New games would just add bots to fill up the games, but that meant that they had to basically make the bots feel like players, which meant that they had to understand vehicle locations, how to drive them, which optimal route to take, where the flag would be, where the flag should go, and even though the Xbox was the most powerful console on the market, it could not handle that. And that's when another crazy idea came to mind. They connected consoles. System Link was the act of connecting multiple consoles so up to 16 players could play in the same match, and this made the inclusion of bigger maps just feel more complete. And then came Xbox Live, able to connect people from across the world. This is probably a surprise to you, just as it was for the developers of Halo, as Xbox Live was made less than a year after Halo was released. But rather than just throw out the idea of connecting consoles, they made it easier by allowing split screen in online matches. This meant that instead of spending hours on connecting 2 consoles, you could just connect to the internet, and then easy as that, you could play with your friends. And this is where split screen stays the same for a while, the only change being that some games only allow 2 players instead of the previous 4, or that online and split screen is its separate thing. The Wii U also used the gamepad as a separate screen, making it less likely to accidentally or intentionally look at the other player's screen. But with the rise of online gaming, split screen is starting to feel like a cheap alternative for playing together. You see, as I said, split screen lowers frame rate, and today frames per second has a lot more influence, as people have realized that it gives you an advantage in competitive games. Not only that, playing online is a lot easier than gathering a group to play your favorite games. And that's why there aren't as many games with split screen, because why would developers include something that not a lot of people use anymore? Not only that, but split screen isn't the reason the games are fun. It's because of the company you have while playing. Split screen just made that company more accessible for a lot of people, including me. However, there is something that split screen does. It makes games last the test of time. Games that rely on online multiplayer will eventually lose players and the online servers will shut down. But with split screen, we can all replay our favorite games together even after online support is long gone. I don't know if I'm just stuck in the past, but for someone who grew up without online multiplayer, split screen meant and still means a lot to me. And while it may stay to some degree, I hope that this is not the end of split screen story.